You will know from the program that this talk is entitled The Japanese Plesiosaur Reconsidered. But before I begin, I would like to make two things clear. The first is my indebtedness to Malcolm Bowden, who's here somewhere. He has done a lot of the spade work on this subject over the last few years, and he has always and unstintingly shared his findings with me. And secondly, the fact that for the purposes of this talk, the term plesiosaur is used in its broadest sense. We know from the fossil record that there are several species who share the same characteristics as a plesiosaur, namely a small head, a long neck, and 4 large and equally sized paddles. We simply cannot tell which of these species the Japanese monster belonged to. We know only that it shared many characteristics of the plesiosaur, and we therefore use the term plesiosaur when speaking of it merely as a matter of convenience. Now, perhaps the most remarkable phenomenon throughout the history of ideas, and indeed throughout the history of science, is the fact that two men can look at exactly the same piece of evidence and come to entirely opposite conclusions as to what that evidence is saying. Consider, if you will, that two astronomers of identical training, background, and qualifications can look out into the universe through the same telescope and see two different things. One of them will see a fantastically organized and ordered cosmos, obeying laws that were laid down by its creator and bearing every evidence of purposeful design, whilst the other will see nothing but a fortuitous concourse of atoms, brought into existence by themselves and obeying laws of their own devising. Now, why should this be? What is it that forces these two men of science into drawing opposite conclusions from the same piece of observable evidence? Well, clearly, it has nothing to do with the evidence itself. That remains the same no matter who is considering it. It has little or nothing to do with the telescope that they're using, but this also remains the same, no matter who is looking through it. And nor does it have anything to do with the emotional state of either observer at the time their observations are made, for their conclusions are generally consistent throughout their scientific careers, whatever mood they might happen to be in at any one time. So exactly what it is that divides our two astronomers, or any other two scientists in their opinions, is something that I shall leave you to ponder as we proceed. The solution to that problem is, happily, something that lies outside the scope of our present subject. But we shall see this same phenomenon, this same mysterious conflict of opinion concerning the same piece of evidence in the subject of this present talk. The specimen that we are about to consider is a fascinating and a most informative illustration of this conflict at work. It is one of those pieces of evidence whose implications are so clear that it immediately divides observers into two camps. Those who say that it is a living example of a creature that just shouldn't be there if evolution theory were true, and those who say that it is not what it appears to be, but is another creature entirely, and one that does not contradict the theory of evolution. So, on the 21st of July, 1977, readers of that most staid and sober of British journals, The Times, read the following article, and I quote, "Japanese fishermen caught a dead monster weighing 2 tons and 30 feet in length off the coast of New Zealand in April, it was reported today. Believed to be a survivor of a prehistoric species, the monster was caught at a depth of 1,000 feet off the South Island coast near Christchurch. Paleontologists from the Natural Science Museum near Tokyo have concluded that the beast belonged to the Plesiosaurus family. Huge, small-headed reptiles with a long neck and 4 fins. After a member of the crew had photographed and measured it, the trawler's captain ordered the corpse to be thrown back into the sea for fear of contamination to his fish. Unquote. That's from the Times on the 21st of July, 1977. And what a remarkable story to read over the breakfast table. But what is perhaps more remarkable is the fact that this story was not reported at that time in any other British newspaper, to my knowledge. Now, why should this be? Could it be that virtually every other British newspaper is, or was then, fed by the Reuters news agency, which seems generally to have suppressed the story, and that the Times does not, or did not then, rely wholly upon Reuters for its releases? Some might think so, but it is nevertheless curious, given the public interest that monsters have always generated, that no other paper in Britain seems to have carried the story at that time. However, after 9 whole days of the deafening silence that followed the appearance of the Times article, it was somberly announced by the BBC on the 30th of July, 1977, that the supposed monster had only looked like a plesiosaur. It was, in fact, the body of a basking shark that must have decomposed in such a way as to resemble a plesiosaur. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was supposed to be that. The BBC, having gained their information from the British Museum of Natural History, had spoken and had issued what we may call an official utterance on the matter. And to quote a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta that was actually set in this town of Portsmouth, "It is a happy circumstance of this glorious country of ours that official utterances are invariably regarded as unanswerable." Unquote. So let us now consider this official utterance of the monster being a basking shark rather than a plesiosaur-type creature, and see how it stands up to the now considerable body of evidence that is available to us. It may surprise us to know that the utterance was made before any good evidence on either side had made its way to the West. Indeed, the symposium of scientists had not yet been called together in Japan to discuss the matter of the creature's identity, and they were not to report their findings until late September of that year, almost 3 months after the BBC's official utterance. Now, the BBC has many fine qualities, but prescience is not among them. And the haste with which the utterance was made might suggest to the cynical amongst us that the creature's identity had been decided upon not because of the evidence, but for fear of what that evidence might later suggest. Be that as it may, since that evidence has come to light, the evolutionary establishment has had many opportunities to revise its opinion concerning the creature's identity. But it has consistently refused to do this. The creature is said to have been a basking shark still. So let us now turn from official utterances on the matter and look at the evidence itself to see what it actually tells us. To begin with, the trawler that dredged up the animal was a Japanese fishing vessel called the Zuiyomaru. She was owned by the Teo Fishery Company, and on the morning of April the 25th, 1977, she was fishing just 30 miles off the New Zealand coast. On board was a marine biologist named Michihiko Yano. He is the crew member mentioned in the Times article, and his job was to check each catch, identify the species, and examine them for any disease or deformities. Now, to do such a job, you need an almost encyclopedic knowledge of marine biology. That knowledge has to embrace hundreds, if not thousands, of species of fish and other creatures, and your knowledge of all the diseases and deformities that can afflict those species must also be necessarily great. The health of the consumer, the prosperity of the fishing company, and the livelihoods of hundreds of fishermen and their families all depend upon the quality and the excellency of that knowledge. Yet here we have the BBC and the Natural History Museum, none of whose members had seen the specimen, asking us to believe that this qualified marine biologist, who knows more about the sea and its creatures than most men could be expected to know, would not know a dead shark when he saw one. And nor, we are assured, by implication at least, would the captain of the vessel or any of his very experienced crew. Consider the magnitude and the enormity of that assertion, if you will, because it's a very important detail in this conflict. But Jarno did not just look at the creature and pronounce its kind. Indeed, to my knowledge, he has never himself suggested that it is a plesiosaur. Others have said that for him. But because of its entirely unfamiliar appearance, he photographed the creature several times from different angles and also made drawings and measurements of its skeletal structure. He took tissue samples for further testing, and then, for no doubt it was he, advised the captain of the vessel to dump the rotting carcass back into the sea before it contaminated the valuable cargo. In short, he did pretty much all he could reasonably be expected to do under the circumstances in which he found himself. And we are very fortunate indeed to have his photographs and his drawing to examine. Let us look briefly now at the photographs. We shall come back to them for a more detailed appraisal a little later. This one is one of two frontal pictures of the monster. Certain details are clearly visible, particularly the skull, the long neck, and the huge, powerful paddles. The skull is there. There's the left eye socket. The lower jawbone is missing, as are the teeth, unfortunately, but the rest of the creature is visible. And we can see, with careful examination, the vertebrae along the neck and the ribs forming the rib cage. The carcass itself was empty when it was dredged out. There were no internal organs to examine, and it was estimated that it had been dead in the water for between 6 and 12 months. The second frontal picture shows much the same details, though taken necessarily at a slightly different angle to the first, due to the pitch and roll of the ship. And the value of this second picture is that it tells us that the details so clearly visible in the first are no trick of the light. What I would like you to look at the moment is this cable, which is supporting the weight of the monster. And it is being bent by this bone, which would be in equivalent to our clavicle or collarbone. Now, for that bone not to snap or bend under that stress tells us that there is no shark or fish bone. Their bones will be far too soft to support that weight and that stress. That is certainly perhaps a mammalian or perhaps a reptilian bone. It is not a fish bone or a shark bone. Let us turn to the third picture, figure 4, which is namely a dorsal or rear view of the monster as it hung above the deck. And here again are certain important details that tell us conclusively the kind of creature that we are dealing with. At all events, they tell us most plainly that this creature is no shark. We shall return to consider the details very shortly, but for the moment we can notice the spinal column and the amount of red meat that is around it. That's something that sharks don't have. Again, we will come back to that. Now, for the final photograph, figure 5, the creature was laid on the deck of the ship so that tissue samples could be taken. And in this photograph, we again see certain important identifying details. The two large globes in the picture are simply floats that belong to one of the dragnets of the ship. But here we can see clearly what remains of the creature's head. Again, the eye socket is there. The cervical or neck vertebrae are clearly visible along here. And what we're looking at here is one of the enormous paddles that are overlying the carcass of the creature. And these have these strange horny fibres coming through them, which again is a feature that sharks don't have, which again we'll consider later. And again, we can see that there was no lower jawbone or mandible. But that's a pity, because that would have allowed us to narrow down the species of the creature if they'd been present. But so that we may consider now in some depth the meaning of these photographs and the treatment that they and the man who took them has received at the hands of the scientific establishment, then we must first carefully consider the findings, or at least the official announcements, that were put out by certain members of the Natural Science Museum of Tokyo. But let us also bear in mind, as we consider the announcements, that some of the men involved in its statements were, by their own recorded admission, not qualified to make them. They were, in every sense, Jarno's scientific inferiors in the field of marine biology. In other words, they were not qualified, as Jarno was, in the field of identifying or recognizing on any important scientific level different species of marine life. How that qualified them to comment on the matter, I shall leave you to wonder at. But it has to be said at this stage that the history of science is filled with instances of scientists who have discovered something embarrassing to the establishment being treated in ways that can so often only be described as shabby in the extreme. And Michihiko Jarno is no exception to this process. We shall see that his good name and character are very subtly but surely besmirched in the Japanese report. And that alone may tell us, as much as any other evidence, just what it was that hung in the rigging of that fishing vessel 23 years ago, and which Michihiko Jarno was rash enough to photograph. The report, surprisingly, was a Franco-Japanese affair, though what exactly the French had to do with this business is nowhere explained. The French organisation under whose umbrella the symposium was conducted was La Société Franco-Japonaise d'Oceanographie. And if ever you wonder why we English don't like speaking foreign languages, that pronunciation would explain. But why, we have to ask, were the Japanese not considered capable of reaching their own conclusions? Well, there are those of a somewhat more cynical disposition than I who are tempted to think that the French involvement was inspired by a very understandable concern in the West over the fact that Japan's national newspapers were openly and repeatedly discussing the fact of living plesiosaurs. Such news is not welcome on this more Darwinian side of the world. Indeed, those same cynical people might be led to think that the French involvement was put in place in order to discredit the evidence before too much of it filtered through to the West. Why on earth they should ever think such a thing is beyond me. But it is worth noting that according to the Times article, which was written in the July of 1977, the Japanese scientists at the same scientific institution, the Natural Science Museum of Tokyo, were unanimous in declaring that the creature was a plesiosaur. But by September of that year, after the French became involved, they're suddenly unanimous in saying it was a shark. Now, did the French involvement begin after July 77? I would love to know, but I don't suppose I ever shall. However, the report was the fruit of two meetings held under the auspices of Japan's Natural Science Museum, the first being held on the 1st of September 1977, at which 12 of the museum scientists were present. Then the second, of which the report was finalised and endorsed, was held on the 19th of September that year. Now, it is a curious and perhaps a telling fact that the one person who should have been invited to that first meeting, but was in fact absent from it, is Michihiko Jarno, the marine biologist who had a great deal of first-hand evidence that he could have laid before the symposium. He was admittedly present at the second meeting, but this meeting was not crucial to the symposium's findings. Those findings, it seems, had already been reached, and the second meeting was held merely to bring things together. But the question must surely remain, as to why Michihiko Yano, the most important person in this whole scenario, was never called upon to give his evidence under any kind of formal examination. Not even a written submission from him is referred to, or was ever required, it seems. Only informal remarks of his, informally obtained before the symposium sat, are alluded to in the report, and that is extraordinary, to say the least. Moreover, Yano is himself subtly disparaged in the report. Firstly, he is described as nothing more than a crewman of the vessel on which the creature was caught. Now, in the mind of anyone reading the report, a crewman of a fishing vessel is one who stands at a table all day, gutting fish or hauling in the nets. He is not generally considered to be a qualified scientist. Whereas the truth of the matter is that Michihiko Yano, who was around 39 years of age at the time of the creature's discovery, was in fact a graduate of the Yamaguchi Oceanological High School, and had gone on from there to become the assistant production manager of the Teo fisheries. Now that is some crewman. And a crewman, we can be sure, who could tell a dead shark when he sees one. Not that you would discover that from what the report says. Furthermore, his character is also seriously called into question in the following way. The first paper in the report was co-authored by two scientific specialists who admit, however, that they are not specialists in any field that could have helped them in identifying the creature at the centre of this investigation. What authority that lends to their conclusions, I shall leave you to guess at. But it does not stop them damning the evidence that they are supposed to be considering so impartially. They complain that the only tissue samples brought back by Yano are a number of horny fibres, and they further lament that the photographs Yano supplies are, and I quote, apt to lead to diverse interpretations, unquote. We might ask ourselves what other photographs, or what better photographic evidence, could he have supplied? These photographs look straightforward enough to us. But more reprehensible still is their statement that Yano's recorded verbal statements, given both publicly and in private interview before the symposium sat, and indeed even the drawing and the measurements that he made of the creature's skeleton, and I quote, may have been largely biased or influenced by the observer's preconception, unquote. Bowden says rightly that this is unjustified. I will go further and say it is positively slanderous. Nothing is said of the bias and preconception of those writing this report, and we shall see an example of that towards the end of the talk. But where, we might ask, does bias come in the honest taking of honest photographs? It is also worth considering something that the symposium has ignored, namely the fact that Yano has never sought any financial or academic advantage or recognition over the discovery. He had no particular axe to grind. So where is this bias and preconception of his supposed to come into the picture? What the statement and its insinuation does accomplish is to bring both Yano's good character and his judgment as a scientist and company employee into question. And if that is successful, then it becomes that much easier to dismiss the evidence that he has brought back. It is, in short, a shameful way for any scientific symposium to proceed. Just what Michihiko Yano thought of it all, we can only guess. But let us look now at how the evidence itself is dealt with in the report, for this is just as illuminating as the facts that we have been considering. Remembering that the supposedly majority verdict of the symposium was that the creature dredged up by the Zuiomaru was a basking shark, we are surprised to read on page 48 of the report a paragraph that says the following, and I quote, "The surface of the body was whitish and covered with dermal fibres, which intersected each other like in whales and other mammals, but were not weak as in fish. There were thick, white, fat-like tissues on the back, and reddish muscles were seen running longitudinally between the white tissues. The putrefactive smell was not like that of teleostin fishes or sharks, but resembled that of marine mammals. The head was said to have been hard, exposing the cranium, and not shark-like. Unlike sharks, in which the nares, or the nostrils, are situated in the lower surface of the skull, the carcass had nares at the front end of what remained at the cranium." Unquote. Now, this is indeed an extraordinary and refreshingly honest statement. For what they are saying here is that this creature had the following 6 characteristics. 1, it has a covering of strong dermal fibres, which is a mammalian feature. It is not found in sharks. 2, it has fat-like tissues, and neither fish nor sharks possess fat. 3, it has red muscles. We shall look at this feature in a moment. 4, the smell was mammalian, and not the ammonia smell of fish and sharks when they decay. 5, the head was hard, where fish and shark heads are soft. And 6, the nares are on the front of the skull, unlike any sharks. As Bowden points out, if only one of these features had been present, then the presence of that one feature alone should have disqualified the shark hypothesis from the outset. But here are 6 important features belonging to our monster, yet unknown in sharks, that together must discount completely any hypothesis claiming this animal is a shark. And yet the report ploughs ahead as if they were all of no significance. Page 65 of the report does admit that sharks do not possess fat. And in the 6th paper, it mentions the decay of the creature's fat to adipocere, which human undertakers know as grave wax. It's a kind of sludge that the fat decays into. Interestingly, though for obvious reasons, the shark hypothesis receives no attention in that particular part of the paper. Concerning the red muscles that are plainly seen on the carcass in figure 4, we encounter the most extraordinary treatment. In the 4th paper, it is admitted that the carcass does clearly show red muscle along the spine. We can see it clearly for ourselves in this picture. Now, I stress again that red muscle is a mammalian feature. It is not found in basking sharks. However, the writer then goes on to diminish this aspect of the evidence by saying this, and I quote, "A former student of mine has informed us that even the muscle of squalid sharks appears as red as tuna meat along both sides of the backbone." Unquote. That appears on page 65 of the report. Now, there are 2 things that are drastically wrong with this statement. Firstly, it is based on hearsay evidence. And since when does hearsay evidence like this find admission into a document that purports to be a scientific paper? The writer had only to go to the museum's well-stocked library to look up the fact, which he could have duly referenced, but instead relies upon the remarks of a former student. Whether he is a good student or a bad student, we're not told. And secondly, whether or not squalid sharks have red meat, they are not basking sharks. There are over 70 different kinds of squalid shark, and the basking shark is not one of them. But then, by sleight of hand, sharks are further referred to without distinction as to whether squalid or basking sharks are meant. If squalid sharks are meant, then they have no place in the discussion. But if basking sharks are meant, then what becomes of the fact that basking sharks have no red meat? It is most unsatisfactory, and the more casual reader will be thoroughly misled by a paper that appears to be informative and pretends to be accurate. The smell of putrefaction, being like that of a decaying marine mammal, rather than the ammonia smell of a decaying shark, is likewise dismissed on the seemingly plausible supposition that the sea must have washed away the smell. But if that ever actually happens, then surely very few decaying sharks would ever have smelled of ammonia. And hence the smell of ammonia would never have become one of the distinguishing characteristics of dead sharks. If the sea had indeed washed away the smell, then there surely would have been no smell at all. But the contrary is the case. There was indeed a strong smell of putrefaction that was well known to the crew of the ship and the marine biologist who made a special note of it. Indeed, it was strong enough to rise above all the other strong smells of a typical fishing vessel. But it was the thoroughly distinctive smell of a decaying marine mammal, not that of a decaying shark. And the sea had clearly failed to wash the smell away. Another fascinating and distinguishing feature of the animal's carcass, which we can see in figure 2, are the very large flippers or paddles that are clearly seen in the photographs. The crewmen, we are told, which suggests that some at least were interviewed with Jarno himself before the symposium was held, are unanimous in saying that the rear flippers were every bit as large as those at the front. This is a very strong indication indeed that a plesiosaur-type creature is represented here. But how does our report deal with this information? Simple. The large rear flippers are said to be nothing more than the claspers that are found on the rear end of male sharks, which are used to hold a female in position during mating. Now, are we seriously to believe that the crewmen who described these rear flippers were so unfamiliar with the appearance of sharks? And shark fin soup, we must remember, is a much sought after and highly saleable delicacy in Japan, so that Japanese fishermen are handling them all the time. Are we seriously to believe that they would not know a clasper from a paddle? And further would not know the difference between large and small? For no shark in the world has claspers that are as big as its fins. And certainly none approach the truly gigantic size of these paddles, all 4 of which were each some 2 meters in length. I would certainly not like to be a Japanese consumer of shark fin soup. If the fishermen catching it for me were that ignorant of a shark's anatomy, you'd never know what you were eating. But let us proceed now to the horny fibres that Michihiko Yano retrieved from the carcass, and which the scientists at the museum were able to examine. We can see them in figure 5. We see them here very clearly indeed, and Yano extracted 42 of these fibres, each of them being between 6 and 10 inches in length. He washed each of them in an antiseptic solution of sodium hypochlorite to prevent further decay. What ordinary crewman would have thought of that? And brought them back to Japan for analysis. When analysed, their amino acid composition was said to be similar in some ways, and not identical, as is often supposed, to that of the protein elastoidin, which happens to be found also in sharks' fins. Ergo, the creature must be a shark, whatever its shape, habitat, and every other consideration might tell us. But what again appears to be overlooked, or perhaps you should say sidestepped in the report, is the fact that basking sharks, though they may well have elastoidin somewhere about them, do not possess the horny fibres that were extracted from the carcass in question. These horny fibres are peculiar to our monster. They are not a shared characteristic of sharks. So the fact that a certain chemical or protein, or one fairly similar to that of a shark, is found in the horny fibre, the very fact that the horny fibre itself is not found in sharks, precludes it from being used in identifying the owner of the horny fibre as a shark. On which subject, and given the unseemly readiness with which these chemical tests have been seized upon in the West as proof positive that the creature must have been a basking shark, it is interesting to read a certain damning admission contained within the report itself. For as the authors of the first paper point out to us, and I quote, No chemical substances have thus far proved to be truly diagnostic for classification of the higher taxa of vertebrates, in spite of the modern biologists' and paleontologists' eager desire to utilize chemical characteristics as clues to investigate animal phylogeny. As to the amino acid composition under discussion, we have been informed that comparative studies of some groups of animals show the existence of many amino acids common to all groups dealt with." Unquote. In other words, elastoidin is a protein that is by no means exclusive property of basking sharks. It is shared by a whole host of other species, which means that such chemical comparisons are pretty much a waste of time, for they tell us little that is meaningful in identifying otherwise mysterious remains. Again, there are those of a more cynical disposition than I, who would wonder at the fact that the members of the symposium who conducted these tests, and who laid such stress upon their ability to identify the creature by means of them, are also seemingly the only members of the symposium who seem to be unaware of the fact that such tests are largely useless. Coincidence, it seems, knows no bounds. But finally, we may consider the much-vaunted allegation contained in the report that the creature had a clearly definable dorsal fin, which, though not present on any species of mammal, is yet a well-known feature of sharks, basking or otherwise. So let us look again at the dorsal view, figure 4, of the carcass, and see what actually lies behind it all. No pun intended. We may begin by noting a remark in the first paper of the report, which tells us on page 49 that, and I quote, "It is also strange that the carcass had paired fins but no dorsal fin." Unquote. Let's read that again. "It is also strange that the carcass had paired fins but no dorsal fin." Unquote. Which makes the following comment from the second paper somewhat interesting. I quote, "Though the dorsal fin has not been mentioned by the eyewitnesses, nor was it shown in the sketch," and as Bowden points out, that's probably because it wasn't there, "the whole shape of a dorsal fin can be recognized in one of the photographs." The photograph in question is the one that we're looking at now. And we have to note that at no point along the creature's considerable spine is there any sign of a dorsal fin, or even the remnant base of a dorsal fin. But that doesn't stop the authors of the paper from claiming that the base of the dorsal fin must have slipped off the spine, since when do they do that, and around to the right of the carcass, where we actually see what is the root or base of the front's right paddle. This is the area here that they're speaking of. They even try to claim that the extraordinary size of the front right paddle is due merely to the fact that the allegedly displaced dorsal fin is overlying the pectoral fin of the shark, thus giving the appearance of a large paddle, when in fact nothing more than two fins are present. Extraordinary. But mark carefully, if you will, that by this hypothesis they fail to explain to us how the left front paddle, which we can see in this picture, figure 2, gained its enormous size. And then what about the rear paddles, that are of the same great dimensions as the two at the front? Exactly how many dorsal fins are we supposed to be considering here? But notice, if you will, how the judgment and observational powers of Michihiko Yano in particular are disparaged in this part of the report. Could he and his fellow crew members really see two shark's fins and mistakenly believe that they were looking at a giant paddle? That it should be only insinuated that his powers of observation, his powers of judgment, and his ability to report accurately what he sees when he is about his business as a marine biologist, and indeed to suggest that his integrity as a scientist is so unreliable that he is prone to make mistakes of that magnitude, mistakes that a first film pupil wouldn't make, are a wounding and an unjustified insult to him. The mind boggles at such unkind treatment. He, of course, is not the first scientist to suffer such disparagement at the hands of an embarrassed establishment. And I don't suppose for one moment that it'll be the last. But his treatment, and indeed the treatment of the evidence that he has supplied, are an object lesson in the nature of vested interests at work. But while we're considering the matter of people's powers of observation and their ability to report accurately what they see, let us now consider the drawing that is supplied by the authors of this paper, which purports to demonstrate the supposed presence of a dorsal fin overlying a pectoral fin to produce the appearance of a paddle. Here we can see the drawing superimposed upon the photograph. And all I can say is that there is so much missing from the drawing as to render it at best unreliable and at worst downright misleading. I'll say further that we are very fortunate indeed to have these photographs before us so that we can see for ourselves what is actually there and not have just a report and its attendant speculations and insinuations, not to say unreliable drawings, to rely upon. Without the photographs, yet another valuable piece of evidence against the theory of evolution would have been consigned to oblivion. And I, for one, salute the man who had the courage as well as the ability to take them. And I mean, of course, Michihiko Yano. Now, Mr. Yano's shabby and unkind treatment in this affair notwithstanding, what I do think would be a mistake, and an unjust one at that, is to say that all those who look at these photographs and see a shark are charlatans, cheats, and liars. They're certainly not. But I do think that our study has come full circle, and we are back to our original two astronomers looking out at this universe through the same telescope and seeing two entirely different things. So it need be of no surprise to us whatever that some will look at these photographs of the creature that we've been considering and see nothing there but a shark, in spite of all the compelling and even the visual evidence against such a possibility. It is one of the strangest phenomena in the history of human thought. But why it should be this way, well, perhaps that's another story. You've been very kind. Thank you very much.